The envelope arrived on a Thursday, thin and official, the kind that carried weight despite containing almost nothing. She held it in her hands for a long moment before opening it. Standing in the narrow kitchen of the apartment she could no longer afford, sunlight streaming through a window that overlooked a parking lot rather than anything worth seeing. The letter inside was brief, impersonal, a final notice dressed in language that pretended to be regretful while offering no real sympathy. 30 days to vacate. The words sat heavy on the page, as if the paper itself understood what they meant. She set it down on the counter next to a stack of other envelopes, most of them unopened because she already knew what they contained. Medical bills from her daughter's emergency room visit 6 months earlier, the one that had drained what little savings existed and left her scrambling ever since. Credit card statements with balances that grew despite her not using them, interest compounding in the background like a quiet threat. A notice from the utility company, polite but firm, explaining that service would be interrupted if payment was not received within 10 days. The architecture of her life had become a tower of paper, each sheet another layer of pressure, another reminder of how quickly stability could dissolve into something unrecognizable. She was 34 years old, though some mornings she felt decades older. Her daughter, Maya, was 7, bright and resilient in ways that both inspired and broke her heart. The girl had learned not to ask for things, had stopped requesting trips to the park or new clothes or the toys she saw other children carrying. That restraint, that premature understanding of scarcity, hurt more than any bill ever could. She had tried to shield Maya from the worst of it, had smiled through conversations about moving as though it were an adventure rather than a necessity, and maintained routines even as the ground beneath them crumbled. But children were perceptive. Maya knew. The morning after the eviction notice arrived, she made breakfast with what remained in the cupboard. Oatmeal, plain, stretched with extra water to make it last longer. Maya ate without complaint, her small hands wrapped around the bowl, her expression focused on the task of finishing rather than savoring. They sat together in silence, the television off to conserve electricity, the apartment filled only with the sounds of their breathing and the occasional scrape of a spoon against ceramic. When Maya finished, she looked up with those dark, serious eyes and asked a question that had been building for weeks. "Are we going to be okay?" The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. She wanted to answer with certainty, to offer the kind of reassurance that parents were supposed to provide without hesitation. Instead, she reached across the small table and took her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently, and said the only thing she could. "I'm working on it." It was not a lie, but it was not the truth Maya deserved either. She had been working on it for months, taking extra shifts at the diner where she waitressed, applying for better jobs that never responded, piecing together childcare arrangements that relied on the kindness of neighbors who had their own struggles. Every solution she found was temporary, every step forward matched by 2 steps back. The mathematics of poverty were unforgiving. You could do everything right and still lose. Later that day, while Maya was at school, she sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop, a second-hand machine that took longer to start than it should. She had been avoiding this moment, but the eviction notice had removed the luxury of avoidance. She needed to find a place to live, something cheap enough to afford on what she earned, but safe enough for a child. The search was depressing. Most listings were out of reach financially. Those within her budget were in neighborhoods she would not risk. A few were possibilities, but required deposits she could not afford and references from landlords who would have nothing positive to say about someone being evicted. She was about to close the laptop when a listing appeared at the bottom of the screen, added recently, marked with a price so low it seemed like a mistake. Property auction. Flooded commercial building. Minimum bid, $500. As is. No inspection. No warranties. The address was listed, along with a single grainy photograph showing the upper portion of a structure half submerged in murky water, its facade stained and damaged, windows dark and lifeless. The caption identified it as a former casino, abandoned after flooding from a river breach 5 years earlier, now being sold by the county to recover unpaid taxes. She stared at the screen, her mind working through the absurdity of what she was considering. $500 was more money than she had, but it was less than a security deposit on an apartment. The building was worthless in its current state, uninhabitable, probably unsalvageable. Yet it was also something she could technically own, a piece of ground that belonged to her rather than to a landlord who could demand she leave. The idea was desperate, irrational, the kind of thing only someone with no other options would entertain. She clicked on the listing and began to read the details. The auction was scheduled for the following week, online bidding only, with the minimum bid set at $500. The property included the building and the land beneath it, roughly 2 acres on the outskirts of town near the old industrial corridor. The structure had once been a mid-sized casino, one of several that had thrived briefly during a period of regional gambling expansion before economic shifts and stricter regulations drove most of them out of business. This one had closed 8 years earlier, sitting vacant until the flood turned its lower levels into a stagnant pool. The county had seized it for unpaid taxes and, after years of trying to find a buyer, had resorted to auction as a last resort. She read the warnings carefully. The building was structurally compromised. Flooding had caused significant damage to the foundation and lower floors. Mold was presumed. Electrical and plumbing systems were non-functional. Access was restricted. The buyer would assume all liability and responsibility for securing, repairing, or demolishing the structure. In essence, purchasing the property meant inheriting a problem no one else wanted. The rational part of her mind, the part that had kept her functioning through months of escalating crisis, told her to close the laptop and forget what she had seen. The desperate part, the part that had run out of alternatives, wondered if there was a way to make it work. That evening, after picking Maya up from school and making dinner from the last of the groceries, she sat on the couch with her daughter and explained what she was thinking. She did not present it as a solution because she was not sure it was. She framed it as an idea, something they could explore together, a possibility that might lead somewhere better. Maya listened with the seriousness she brought to everything now, her small face thoughtful, her questions practical in a way that felt too mature for 7. Where we sleep? I don't know yet. We'd have to see what parts of the building are safe. Will we have water? Not at first. We'd have to bring it in until we could fix the pipes. What about school? You'd stay at the same school. I'll make sure of that. Maya was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that mattered most. Do you think it will work? She looked at her daughter, at the trust still visible in those dark eyes despite everything they had been through, and felt the weight of what she was about to do settle over her. This was not a plan. It was a gamble, the kind made by people who had nothing left to lose. But it was also a chance, however slim, to stop the descent and find footing again. She reached over and pulled Maya close, feeling the warmth of her small body, and spoke the truth as she understood it. I think we have to try. The decision to bid on the property was not made lightly, but it was made quickly. She had learned that hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. By the end of the week, she had scraped together the $500, borrowing from a co-worker who had asked no questions and expected repayment only when possible. She registered for the auction, entered her bid on the morning it opened, and waited. The process was anticlimactic. No competing bids appeared. No last-minute interest materialized. When the auction closed that evening, the property was hers by default, the only person willing to take on what everyone else recognized as a burden. The notification came through email, sterile and official, congratulating her on a successful bid and providing instructions for payment and transfer of title. She read it twice, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. She had done it. She now owned a flooded casino worth less than the cost of a month's rent. The absurdity of the situation would have been laughable if the stakes were not so high. Instead, she saved the email, shut down the laptop, and began to plan what came next. Telling people proved harder than the purchase itself. Her mother's reaction was immediate and harsh, delivered over the phone in a tone that mixed anger with disappointment. The words came fast, each one sharp enough to cut. What are you thinking? You spent money you don't have on a building that's falling apart. You have a child to think about. This is reckless. She listened without defending herself, knowing that any explanation would only deepen the disapproval. When her mother finally paused, she said simply that the decision was made and ended the call before the conversation could spiral further. Her co-workers at the diner responded with a mixture of concern and poorly concealed judgment. A few offered supportive words, generic and careful, the kind of thing people said when they did not know what else to offer. Others were less tactful. One asked if she was having a breakdown. Another joked that she must really hate stability. The manager, a woman who had always been fair but distant, pulled her aside during a break and asked if she needed time off to sort things out. The implication was clear. Her choices were being viewed as evidence of poor judgment, of desperation crossing into irresponsibility. The neighbor who had been watching Maya after school, an older woman who lived 2 doors down and had grandchildren of her own, expressed worry more gently. She asked what the plan was, how they would manage, whether she had thought it through. The questions were kind, but they carried the same underlying message everyone else had delivered. This was a mistake. You are making things worse. When she tried to explain that she had no better options, that staying in the apartment meant homelessness in 30 days, the neighbor nodded with the weariness of someone who had heard too many stories like this before and knew how most of them ended. The judgment extended beyond individuals. She could feel it in the way people looked at her now, in the subtle shifts in tone when they spoke, in the conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She had become the woman who bought the flooded casino, a label that carried with it assumptions about competence, stability, and sanity. The mockery was rarely direct, but it was pervasive, woven into interactions that should have been mundane. Even strangers seemed to know. The cashier at the grocery store, the clerk at the county office where she filed the paperwork for the title transfer, the postal worker who delivered the official documents. News traveled quickly in a town this size, and hers was the kind of story that invited commentary. Maya absorbed it all with the quiet resilience she had developed over the past year. She did not complain when classmates asked why her mom had bought a broken building. She did not cry when a teacher, meaning well, suggested that maybe they should talk to someone about their living situation. But the weight of it showed in small ways. The way she held her backpack closer when walking through the school hallways. The way she asked fewer questions about the future. The way she started drawing pictures of houses that looked nothing like the apartment or the casino, perfect little structures with neat lawns and curtains in the windows, places that existed only in imagination. The first time she saw the property in person, the reality of what she had purchased hit her with a force she had not anticipated. She drove out alone on a Saturday morning, leaving Maya with a neighbor, telling herself she needed to assess the situation before bringing her daughter into it. The route took her through parts of town she rarely visited, past shuttered factories and empty lots where businesses had once thrived, evidence of an economy that had contracted long before the flood. The casino sat at the end of a cracked access road, surrounded by chain-link fence that had been bent and torn in places, its gate hanging open on broken hinges. She parked near the entrance and sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the building through the windshield. From this distance, it looked worse than the photograph had suggested. The structure was large, 3 stories of stained concrete and broken glass, its facade darkened by water damage that had crept upward like a slow infection. The lower third was still submerged, murky water lapping against walls that had once been painted in bright colors meant to attract attention. Now they were muted, the paint peeling away in long strips, exposing the gray beneath. Weeds had overtaken the parking lot, pushing through cracks in the asphalt, reclaiming territory that had been paved over decades earlier. She stepped out of the car, the air immediately heavier here, thick with the smell of stagnant water and decay. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, soft in places where flooding had saturated the soil and never fully drained. She walked slowly toward the building, her eyes scanning for entry points, for signs of structural stability, for anything that might suggest this was salvageable. The front entrance was inaccessible, blocked by water that had risen to cover the doors entirely. She circled around, noting the windows on the upper floors, some broken, others intact but filmed over with grime and moisture. At the side of the building, She found a fire escape, its metal frame rusted but still attached to the wall. The ladder was retracted, hanging several feet above her reach, but a stack of old pallets nearby suggested that others had found ways to access it. She tested the pallets carefully, stacking them until they formed a crude platform, then climbed up, her hands gripping the rough wood, her heart pounding with the exertion and the awareness of how easily this could go wrong. When she reached the ladder, she pulled it down, its hinges protesting with a high metallic screech that echoed across the empty lot. The climb to the second floor was slow, each step deliberate, the metal cold and slick beneath her hands. When she reached the platform, she paused to catch her breath and looked back at the ground below. From this height, the scale of the property became clearer. The casino was larger than she had realized, its footprint sprawling, connected to a secondary structure that might have been a parking garage or an annex. The water surrounding it was dark, its surface broken by debris, planks of wood, chunks of concrete, unidentifiable objects half submerged and rotting. It looked like a graveyard for a place that had died badly. She turned her attention to the window beside the platform. The glass was intact, but the frame was warped, swollen from moisture. She pressed against it, testing for give, and, after several attempts, managed to force it open enough to slip through. The interior greeted her with a wave of stale air, thick and oppressive, carrying the unmistakable smell of mold. She stepped inside carefully, her feet landing on a floor that felt solid but creaked ominously beneath her weight. Daylight filtered through the dirty windows, casting the space in dim gray tones that made everything look older than it was. The room appeared to have been an office or administrative space. Desks were arranged in rows, though most had been overturned or pushed against the walls. Papers were scattered across the floor, their ink faded and smeared, rendered illegible by moisture. A filing cabinet stood in one corner, its drawers hanging open, empty. The walls bore the faint outlines of frames that had once held pictures or certificates, now absent, leaving only rectangular patches of cleaner paint to mark their presence. It was a place that had been abandoned in a hurry, emptied of value, and left to decay. She moved through the space slowly, testing each step, listening for sounds that might indicate instability. The building was silent except for the occasional drip of water somewhere deeper inside and the faint groan of settling wood. She passed through a doorway into a corridor lined with more offices, each one in similar condition, stripped and decaying. At the end of the hall, a staircase descended toward the lower floors, its steps disappearing into darkness. She stood at the top for a long moment, staring down, knowing she would need to explore further, but reluctant to do so without better light and preparation. Instead, she climbed to the third floor, where the damage seemed less severe. Here, the windows were mostly intact, and the floors felt more stable underfoot. She found larger rooms that might have been event spaces or lounges, their layouts still discernible beneath the layers of dust and neglect. One room had a stage at one end, its surface cracked but intact, the remnants of old curtains hanging limply from a rod above. She stood in the center of the space and turned slowly, taking it all in, trying to imagine what this place had been when it was alive, filled with people and noise and light. The effort was difficult. The present condition overwhelmed any sense of former grandeur. By the time she made her way back to the fire escape, the sun was higher, and the heat had begun to build. She climbed down carefully, her muscles aching, her mind churning through what she had seen. The building was worse than she had feared, but not entirely hopeless. There were dry spaces on the upper floors, rooms that could theoretically be made habitable with enough work. The structure, despite its obvious flaws, had not collapsed. That alone suggested some underlying strength, some foundation that had resisted the worst of the flood. Whether it was enough to build on remained unclear, but it was something. When she returned to the apartment that evening, Maya was waiting with questions. She answered them honestly, describing the building, the water, the mold, the amount of work it would require. She did not soften the reality or pretend it would be easy. Maya listened, then asked the question that mattered most. Can we live there? Not yet, but maybe eventually. When? I don't know. The uncertainty hung between them, familiar and exhausting. That night, after Maya had gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and began to make lists. What needed to be done first? What materials would be required? What skills she would need to learn or hire out? The task felt insurmountable, an endless series of problems without clear solutions. Yet the alternative, staying in the apartment until eviction forced them out, was no longer an option. She had committed herself to this path, reckless as it might be, and now she had to see it through. The following week, she began the process of preparing to move, though move was perhaps too generous a word for what she was about to attempt. She packed their belongings into boxes borrowed from the grocery store, sorting ruthlessly, discarding anything they could live without. The apartment they were leaving had never been large, but it had contained the accumulation of years, the small comforts and unnecessary objects that made a place feel like home. Most of it would have to go. She kept only what was essential, what could be transported easily, what could survive a period of uncertain living conditions. On her final day at the apartment, the landlord arrived to inspect the unit, his expression neutral, but his posture conveying judgment. He walked through the rooms, noting the condition, the absence of damage, the cleanliness she had maintained despite everything. When he was finished, he handed her a receipt for the security deposit, minus deductions for early termination. The amount was less than she had hoped, but more than she had expected. She took it without comment, folded it carefully, and placed it in her pocket. As she carried the last boxes to her car, the neighbor who had watched Maya appeared at her door, holding a bag of supplies. Food, batteries, flashlights, a first aid kit. She handed it over without saying much, her expression sad but kind, the gesture speaking louder than words. Others in the building watched from windows or doorways, some waving, others simply observing, as if witnessing the departure of someone who had made a choice they could not understand but could recognize as final. By mid-afternoon, everything they owned was loaded into her car and a small trailer she had borrowed. She buckled Maya into the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the building that had been their home, their eyes forward, focused on the road ahead. The drive to the casino took less than 20 minutes, but it felt longer, each mile carrying the weight of everything they were leaving behind and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. When they finally pulled onto the access road, the building looming in front of them like a challenge, she turned to her daughter and found her staring at it with an expression that was neither afraid nor hopeful, only watchful. "Are you ready?" Maya nodded once, then opened her door and stepped out into the weeds. The first night inside the casino was not romantic or adventurous. It was uncomfortable, cold, and punctuated by sounds that kept both of them awake far longer than they should have been. She had chosen a room on the third floor, one with intact windows and a floor that felt stable, though she had tested it extensively before agreeing to trust it. She set up their sleeping bags on a section of floor she had cleaned as best she could, using water she had brought in bottles and rags torn from old towels. The space smelled of disinfectant now instead of mold, a small victory that felt significant in the moment, but inadequate once the sun set and darkness closed in. Maya had been quiet through most of the setup, helping where she could, carrying lighter items, arranging their belongings in the corner where they would sleep. She had not complained, had not asked why they could not stay somewhere else, somewhere normal. But as the light faded and the building around them settled into its nightly creaks and groans, she moved closer, her small body pressed against her mother's side, her voice small when she finally spoke. "Is it safe here?" "Yes, we're safe." It was a promise she wanted to believe, though the confidence it required felt hollow. The building was massive, full of dark corners and unexplored spaces, its lower level submerged in water that could hide anything. She had locked the fire escape door behind them, had checked the windows, had done everything she could think of to secure their position. Yet security was a relative concept. They were alone in an abandoned structure with no electricity, no running water, no way to call for help if something went wrong. The phone service here was inconsistent, a single bar that flickered in and out depending on where she stood. She had tested it earlier, confirming that it worked just enough to be useful in an emergency, though the definition of emergency felt broader now. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by sounds she could not identify. The distant splash of something moving through the water below. The groan of metal expanding or contracting with temperature changes. The scratch of small animals navigating walls or ceilings. Each time she woke, she reached instinctively for Maya, checking to make sure she was still there, still safe, still asleep. By the time morning light crept through the windows, she felt more exhausted than she had the night before, her body heavy, her thoughts sluggish. Maya woke with the dawn, sitting up in her sleeping bag and looking around the room with quiet curiosity. The fear from the previous night seemed to have faded, replaced by something harder to name. Acceptance, perhaps, or simply the resilience of a child who had learned to adapt. She asked for breakfast, and they ate granola bars and drank water from bottles, sitting on the floor with their backs against the wall, watching as the room brightened and revealed its flaws more clearly. Stains on the ceiling, cracks in plaster, the faint shadow of mold that had survived her cleaning. After breakfast, she took Maya back down the fire escape and drove her to school, the routine providing a structure that felt almost normal. She did not tell the teachers where they were living now, did not explain the change in circumstances beyond saying they had moved. Maya was quiet during the drop-off, her expression neutral, her goodbye brief. As she drove away, watching her daughter disappear into the building, she felt the full weight of what she had done. She had uprooted them from instability into something far worse, had gambled their safety on a building that could collapse at any moment, had subjected her child to conditions no parent should accept. The rest of the day was spent beginning the work. She returned to the casino with supplies purchased using the last of the security deposit refund. Cleaning materials, tarps, basic tools, extension cords, and a portable generator small enough to carry, but powerful enough to run lights and charge devices. She hauled everything up the fire escape in stages, her arms burning with effort, her lungs struggling in the thick air. By midday, she had established a base of operations in the room where they had slept, setting up the generator in a corner near a window where ventilation could carry the fumes outside. The work of making the space livable was slow and unglamorous. She scrubbed floors until her hands were raw, removing layers of grime that had accumulated over years. She patched cracks in the walls using compound and tape, knowing the repairs were cosmetic but needing to see progress. She tested every window, every door, every section of floor within the areas she intended to use, marking weak spots with tape and avoiding them afterward. The generator ran for a few hours each evening, providing light and the ability to charge her phone, a lifeline to the outside world that felt increasingly distant. By the end of the first week, they had settled into a rhythm that resembled survival more than living. She woke early, drove Maya to school, returned to work on the building, picked Maya up in the afternoon, and spent the evenings in the room that had become their home. They ate simple meals, played card games by lantern light, and slept in sleeping bags that smelled faintly of mildew, no matter how many times she aired them out. The building remained oppressive, its presence a constant reminder of how far they had fallen, but it also provided something they had not had in the apartment. Space. Silence. The absence of a landlord's demands. Maya adapted in ways that both impressed and worried her. The girl had stopped asking when they would leave, stopped talking about the apartment they had lost, stopped mentioning friends who lived in houses with electricity and running water. Instead, she focused on small tasks, helping to carry supplies, organizing their belongings, finding ways to make the space feel less hostile. She arranged their few books on a makeshift shelf, hung drawings on the wall using tape, and designated specific corners for specific purposes. It was the behavior of someone learning to cope, and it broke her heart even as it filled her with pride. The mockery from the outside world did not stop. If anything, it intensified once word spread that they were actually living in the building. The woman at the diner asked if they were sleeping in tents. A former neighbor texted to say she had heard about the move and hoped everything was okay, the message carrying a tone of pity that stung more than outright criticism. Her mother called once, the conversation brief and painful, ending with a statement rather than a question. "You need to reconsider this." She ended the call without responding, knowing that reconsideration was a luxury reserved for people with alternatives. She had none. This was the path she had chosen, and whether it led somewhere better or simply delayed the inevitable collapse, she had no choice but to follow it. The discovery happened on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after they had moved in. She was exploring the second floor more thoroughly, mapping out which rooms were accessible and which were too damaged to risk entering. The water level had receded slightly, exposing sections of the lower floor that had been submerged during her first visit. She noted the change with interest, wondering if it indicated natural drainage or simply seasonal variation, and decided to investigate further. Using a ladder she had found in one of the upper rooms, she descended into a stairwell that led to the ground floor. The water here was still present, but shallower, covering the floor to a depth of about 2 feet. She waded in carefully, her boots immediately soaked, the water cold and thick with sediment. The smell was worse down here, a concentrated version of the decay that permeated the entire structure, and she had to breathe through her mouth to keep from gagging. The ground floor had been the main casino area, its layout still discernible beneath the damage. Slot machines stood in rows, their mechanisms corroded and useless. Tables were overturned, their surfaces warped beyond repair. A long bar ran along one wall, its wood swollen and splitting, bottles still resting on shelves behind it, their labels dissolved into illegible smears. She moved through the space slowly, her light cutting through the gloom, revealing details that suggested how suddenly this place had been abandoned. In one corner, she found what appeared to have been a cash handling station, a reinforced booth with barred windows and a heavy door that hung open on broken hinges. She stepped inside, the water shallower here, protected by a raised floor that had kept it slightly above the floodline. Metal drawers were pulled out, empty, their contents long since removed. But the structure itself was intact, its walls thick, its design suggesting that valuable items had once been stored here. As she turned to leave, her light caught something unusual. The back wall of the booth did not align perfectly with the rest of the structure. There was a gap, narrow but visible, where the paneling met the floor at an angle rather than flush. She knelt in the water, ignoring the cold seeping through her jeans, and examined it more closely. The gap was deliberate, not a flaw in construction, but a seam designed to be opened. She ran her fingers along the edge, searching for a latch or lever, and found it recessed into the wall, hidden by design, but accessible once you knew to look. She pressed it, and the panel shifted, swinging inward with a grinding sound that echoed through the empty space. Behind it was a narrow passage, descending into darkness, its walls lined with metal rather than wood, its construction far more substantial than anything else she had seen in the building. Her heart began to pound, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that she had found something intentionally concealed. This was not part of the public casino. This was something else. She adjusted her light and stepped through the opening, her movements cautious, her senses alert for any sign of instability. The passage continued for several feet, then opened into a small room that took her breath away. The vault was modest, no larger than a walk-in closet, its walls lined with steel shelves. On those shelves, arranged in neat rows, were bars of dull yellow metal. Gold. She stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The bars were stacked carefully, each one marked with stamps she could not read in the dim light, but whose purpose was unmistakable. This was not decoration. This was wealth, real and tangible, hidden beneath a building no one had cared about for years. She stepped closer, reaching out to touch one of the bars, its surface cold and heavier than she expected when she lifted it. The weight confirmed what her eyes were telling her. This was not replica or theatrical prop. It was genuine. She set it back carefully and began to count, her hands trembling, her breath coming faster. The shelves held dozens of bars, stacked in rows that extended back into the shadows. She did not know how much gold this represented, but even in her limited understanding, she knew it was far more than $500 worth. The discovery should have felt like a miracle, like the answer to every problem she faced. Instead, it felt like a new burden, heavy and complicated, one that would bring its own challenges. She stood in that small vault for a long time, her light casting shadows that danced across the metal, her thoughts racing through implications she could not yet fully grasp. Eventually, she stepped back, closed the hidden panel, and made her way out of the water, her mind already moving ahead to what came next. When she picked Maya up from school that afternoon, she drove in silence, her thoughts consumed by the vault and what it meant. She did not tell her daughter what she had found, not yet, knowing that the knowledge would change everything and needing time to understand how to manage it. That night, after Maya was asleep, she sat alone in the dark room, staring at the ceiling, and allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had stumbled into. The gold was real. It was hidden, and it was now hers, whether she wanted the responsibility or not. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay in her sleeping bag, listening to Maya's steady breathing beside her, her mind replaying the moment she had opened that hidden panel over and over. The image of those gold bars, stacked methodically on steel shelves, refused to fade. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw them again, their dull surfaces catching the beam of her flashlight, their weight solid and undeniable in her hands. The discovery had shifted something fundamental in her, understanding of her situation, though she could not yet name exactly what. By morning, exhaustion had settled into her bones, but her thoughts had clarified into a single urgent question. Was the gold actually real? The possibility that it might be theatrical prop material or some elaborate replica gnawed at her. She had lifted one bar, felt its weight, seen the stamps pressed into its surface. But she was not an expert. She had no training in precious metals, no experience that would allow her to distinguish genuine gold from a convincing imitation. The only way to know for certain was to have it examined by someone who did. That realization brought with it a cascade of complications. Taking even a single bar out of the vault meant exposing what she had found. Once someone else knew, the secret would no longer be hers to control. Word would spread, questions would be asked, authorities might become involved, claiming jurisdiction over property found on land she technically owned, but within a building whose history she barely understood. The gold might be seized as evidence, tied up in legal proceedings that could last years, leaving her exactly where she had started, but with the added burden of attention she could not afford. Yet the alternative was to do nothing, to leave the gold hidden while she continued scrubbing floors and rationing food, knowing that wealth beyond comprehension sat untouched beneath her feet. The absurdity of that scenario was almost worse than the risk. She had stumbled into something extraordinary, something that could change everything, and to ignore it felt like a failure of nerve she could not accept. By the time she dropped Maya at school, her decision was made. She would take one bar, she would have it tested discreetly, and she would proceed based on what she learned. The challenge was finding someone trustworthy enough to examine the gold without immediately reporting it or attempting to take it from her. She spent the morning in the casino, moving through rooms she had not yet explored, ostensibly looking for more hidden spaces, but really just buying time while her mind worked through options. Eventually, she settled on a pawn shop owner she had met briefly months earlier, a man who dealt in estate jewelry and precious metals, whose reputation suggested discretion more than greed. It was not a perfect solution, but it was the best she could devise. That afternoon, after picking Maya up from school and dropping her with a neighbor who still watched her occasionally, she returned to the casino. The walk back down to the ground floor felt longer this time, the water colder, the darkness more oppressive. She retraced her path to the cash-handling booth, found the hidden latch, and opened the panel. The vault looked exactly as she had left it, untouched and patient, as though it had been waiting decades for someone to find it. She chose a bar from the middle of a stack, reasoning that its absence would be less noticeable than taking one from the top or bottom. The weight surprised her again when she lifted it, solid and dense, in a way that felt significant. She wrapped it carefully in an old towel, then placed it in a canvas bag she had brought for this purpose. The bag hung heavy on her shoulder as she climbed back up to the third floor, her muscles straining, her breathing labored. By the time she reached her car, Sweat had soaked through her shirt despite the cool air. The pawn shop was located downtown, wedged between a thrift store and a vacant storefront. She had passed it dozens of times without paying much attention, but now she studied it carefully before entering. The windows were barred, the interior dimly lit, the sign above the door faded but still legible. She pushed through the entrance, a bell chiming overhead, and found herself in a narrow space crowded with display cases and shelves packed with items that spoke of other people's desperation. Jewelry, electronics, musical instruments, tools. The accumulated possessions of lives that had needed cash more than memories. The owner appeared from a back room, an older man with gray hair and watchful eyes that assessed her in a single glance. She recognized him immediately, though they had never spoken beyond pleasantries. He nodded in greeting, his expression neutral, waiting for her to state her business. She hesitated, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was, standing in a strange shop with a fortune in her bag and no way to protect herself if things went wrong. But she had come too far to retreat now. She set the bag on the counter and unwrapped the bar slowly, revealing it in stages as if the delay might somehow make the moment less fraught. When the gold finally sat exposed on the towel, its surface dull under the fluorescent lights, the man's expression shifted. Not dramatically, not with obvious greed or surprise, but with a subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested recognition. He reached for it without asking, his movements careful, and lifted it as she had, testing its weight. Then he set it down and leaned closer, examining the stamps pressed into the metal. "Where did you get this?" His voice was quiet, measured, but the question carried weight she could not ignore. She had prepared an answer, something vague about an estate sale, a storage unit, a relative's belongings. But standing there with his eyes on her, she found the lie would not come. Instead, she said simply that she had found it in a property she owned. The truth, stripped of detail. He studied her for a long moment, then returned his attention to the bar. "I need to test it." She nodded, watching as he moved to a workbench along the back wall and retrieved a small case filled with tools she did not recognize. He worked methodically, scraping a tiny portion of the metal, applying acids from small bottles, observing reactions with a jeweler's loupe pressed to his eye. The process took less than 10 minutes, but it felt longer, each moment stretching as she waited for confirmation of what she already believed. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed again. This time there was no neutrality, no professional distance. There was respect, and perhaps a trace of envy. "It's real. 24 karat, near pure. Probably dates back 40 or 50 years based on these markings. Where did you say you found this?" She did not answer the question directly. Instead, she asked what it was worth. He set the bar down and pulled out a calculator, his fingers moving quickly across the keys. Gold prices fluctuated, he explained, but based on current market rates and the weight of this particular bar, it was worth approximately $65,000. Possibly more to a private buyer, possibly less if she needed to sell quickly. The number hung in the air between them, vast and surreal. She felt her legs weaken and reached for the counter to steady herself. $65,000 for a single bar, and there were dozens more in the vault, stacked on shelves that had not been disturbed in years. The mathematics were almost too large to process. Millions. She owned millions of dollars in gold, hidden beneath a building everyone had dismissed as worthless. The magnitude of it pressed down on her, stealing her breath. The shop owner was speaking again, his voice cutting through her thoughts. He was asking if she wanted to sell, offering to buy it outright, or connect her with buyers who dealt in larger quantities. She heard the words, but could not fully absorb them. Her mind was still in the vault, counting bars, calculating totals that grew larger with each passing second. Eventually, she managed to speak, her voice steadier than she felt. "Not yet. I need time." He nodded, understanding without needing explanation. He wrapped the bar carefully and handed it back to her, then offered a business card with his direct number written on the back. If she decided to sell, he said she should call him first. He could help her navigate the process, ensure she got fair value, protect her from people who would take advantage. She accepted the card, tucked it into her pocket, and left the shop with the bar still in her bag, heavier now, with confirmed value, than it had been with mere possibility. The drive back to the casino passed in a blur. Her hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, her knuckles white, her thoughts racing faster than she could organize them. She had verification now. The gold was real. What she had found was not a curiosity or a strange footnote to the building's history. It was a fortune hidden deliberately, preserved by accident, and now legally hers by virtue of purchasing property no one else had wanted. That night, after Maya was asleep, she sat alone in the dark and allowed herself to feel the full emotional weight of what had happened. Relief came first, washing over her in waves so intense they brought tears. The constant pressure that had defined her life for months, the fear of homelessness, the shame of poverty, the exhaustion of scrambling for survival, all of it could end. She could pay her debts, secure stable housing, give Maya the life she deserved. The future, which had narrowed to a series of desperate calculations, suddenly opened wide. But relief was followed quickly by fear. She now possessed something valuable enough to attract dangerous attention. People had killed for far less than what sat hidden in the vault beneath her feet. If word spread before she could secure the gold properly, she would become a target. The building's isolation, which had felt like a burden, now felt like a vulnerability. She was alone here with her daughter, unprotected, surrounded by darkness and water and empty rooms that could hide threats until it was too late. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and shallow. She woke multiple times, startled by sounds that were probably nothing but could have been everything. Each time she reached for Maya instinctively, reassuring herself that the girl was still there, still safe, still unaware of how dramatically their circumstances had changed. By morning, she had made several decisions. She would not tell anyone else about the gold until she had a plan. She would research the building's history to understand how the vault had come to exist. And she would begin the slow process of securing the bars, moving them to a location less exposed than a flooded casino. The research proved more difficult than expected. Records for the casino were sparse, scattered across county archives and old newspaper databases that required hours of searching to yield even fragments of information. What she did find painted a picture of a business that had thrived briefly in the late 1970s and early 1980s before regulatory changes and economic shifts drove it under. The casino had been owned by a man whose name appeared in several articles, always in connection with legal troubles that never quite resulted in convictions. Tax evasion, money laundering, connections to organized crime. The accusations were serious but never proven, and the man himself had died years before the building flooded, his estate dispersed among creditors and family members who wanted nothing to do with his legacy. The vault made sense now. It had been a way to hide assets, to keep wealth off the books, away from auditors and investigators who might seize it. The gold had probably been accumulated slowly over years, skimmed from profits, purchased discreetly, stored in a location only a few trusted people knew about. When the casino closed, someone had either forgotten the vault existed or chosen deliberately to leave it behind, perhaps believing the building would eventually be demolished or that returning to retrieve the gold would be too risky. Whatever the reason, it had remained undisturbed through abandonment, flooding, and foreclosure, waiting for someone desperate enough to buy a worthless building to stumble across it. She spent days verifying details, cross-referencing names and dates, building a timeline that would support her ownership claim if challenged. The gold had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades. No one had reported it missing. No heirs had come forward demanding its return. The property was hers legally, purchased through a legitimate auction with clear title transfer. What had been hidden inside the building at the time of purchase became hers as well. The logic was sound, though she knew it would be tested. While she worked through the research, practical challenges continued to demand attention. Maya needed to be fed, taken to school, kept occupied, and reassured. The building still lacked electricity and running water beyond what she carried in herself. The work of making even one room livable was exhausting, and now she had to balance it against the urgent need to secure wealth she could not yet access safely. The contrast was absurd. She was a millionaire sleeping in a moldy building, cooking meals on a camp stove, washing dishes in water. She hauled up 3 flights of stairs. The first person outside the pawn shop owner to learn about the gold was not someone she chose to tell. It was the property inspector who arrived unannounced one afternoon, sent by the county to assess the building's condition and determine whether it posed a public safety hazard. She had known inspections were possible, even likely, but had hoped to delay them until she had secured the vault and could control the narrative. Instead, she found herself scrambling to appear cooperative while steering the inspector away from areas that might raise questions. The man was thorough, professional, and impossible to redirect. He moved through the accessible floors with systematic efficiency, taking photographs, making notes, asking questions about her intentions for the property. When he asked to see the ground floor, she explained that it was still flooded, unsafe to enter. He nodded, but insisted on at least viewing it from above, and she had no reasonable way to refuse. Together they stood at the top of the stairwell, looking down into the dark water, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. That's significant structural damage. You're aware this building may need to be condemned? She kept her voice steady, explaining that she was working toward repairs, that she had limited resources but was making progress. He did not look convinced, but made no move to escalate. Instead, he completed his inspection, handed her a preliminary report, and left with a warning that a more detailed assessment would follow. She watched him drive away, her heart pounding, knowing that time was now a factor she could no longer control. That night she made a decision that felt both reckless and necessary. She would begin moving the gold. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to reduce the risk of losing everything if the building were condemned or if someone else discovered the vault. She spent hours researching secure storage options, finally settling on a safety deposit box at a bank 30 miles away, far enough that no one would connect it to the casino, but close enough to access when needed. The box would hold only a fraction of the total, but it would be a start, a hedge against catastrophe. The process of moving the gold was nerve-wracking. She waited until late evening, after Maya was asleep, then made her way back down to the vault. She chose 10 bars, wrapping each one carefully before placing them in a sturdy backpack. The weight was immense, pressing down on her shoulders until they ached, but she managed to climb back to the 3rd floor without incident. She hid the backpack in her car, covered with blankets, and tried to sleep knowing that a fortune sat in her trunk. The next morning, she drove Maya to school as usual, then continued on to the bank. The safety deposit box clerk processed her request without comment, leading her to a private room where she could transfer the bars. When she opened the backpack and the clerk caught a glimpse of what was inside, her expression shifted to carefully maintain neutrality. She asked no questions, completed the paperwork, and left her alone to secure the contents. The relief she felt locking the box and pocketing the key was profound but temporary. 9 more trips would be required to move the rest, and each one carried risk. Word began to spread despite her efforts at discretion. It started small, with rumors rather than facts. Someone had seen her carrying heavy bags from the casino. Someone else had noticed her visiting a bank far from her usual route. The pawn shop owner, despite his assurances of confidentiality, had apparently mentioned to someone that he had seen unusual gold. The details were vague, distorted by repetition and speculation, but the core idea took hold. The woman who had bought the flooded casino had found something valuable inside. The mockery that had defined reactions to her purchase began to shift, though not uniformly. Some people doubled down, insisting that any rumors of treasure were fantasy, that she was either lying or deluded. Others grew quiet, their skepticism giving way to uncertainty. A few, the ones who had been most vocal in their criticism, suddenly wanted to know more, asking questions that felt less like curiosity and more like attempts to assess whether they had misjudged the situation. She answered none of them directly, maintaining the same careful neutrality she had practiced with the bank clerk. Her mother called, the conversation tense from the first word. She had heard things, she said, stories that made no sense, claims that seemed designed to make her earlier criticism look foolish. She wanted to know if any of it was true. The question hung between them, loaded with years of strained relationship and recent judgments. She could have lied, could have deflected, could have protected her mother from the knowledge that she had been wrong. Instead, she said simply that she had found something in the building, that it was being handled properly, and that she would share details when the time was right. The silence that followed was long and complicated. The shift in perception was not immediate, but it was undeniable. People who had avoided her began approaching tentatively, their expressions awkward, their words carefully chosen. The diner manager asked if she planned to keep working, the question implying that perhaps she no longer needed to. A teacher at Maya's school mentioned hearing good news, her tone suggesting she wanted confirmation without asking directly. Even strangers seemed to treat her differently, as though some invisible marker had changed, alerting them that she was no longer what she had appeared to be. Maya noticed the change too, though she did not understand its source. Classmates who had avoided her began including her in games at recess. Teachers spoke to her with renewed attention. The shift was subtle but real, and it confused her in ways she struggled to articulate. One evening, sitting in their room in the casino, she asked her mother why people were being nicer suddenly. The question was innocent, but it carried the weight of a child who had learned that kindness was conditional, that how people treated you depended on factors beyond your control. She struggled to answer honestly without burdening Maya with cynicism too early. She explained that sometimes people made judgments quickly without knowing all the facts, and that when new information came to light, those judgments changed. It was not a complete answer, but it was as close to the truth as she could manage. Maya accepted it with the same quiet resilience she had shown through everything else, nodding slowly before returning her attention to the book she had been reading. The authentication process expanded beyond the single bar she had shown the pawn shop owner. On his recommendation, she contacted a metals assayer with a reputation for discretion and expertise. The meeting took place in the man's office, a small space above a jewelry store, where she presented 3 more bars for examination. He worked with the same methodical care she had observed before, testing each one thoroughly, documenting his findings in a report she would need if legal challenges arose. When he finished, his assessment confirmed what she already knew but still needed to hear from an authoritative source. The gold was genuine, high purity, and consistent with bars produced in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The stamps indicated they had likely been purchased from reputable dealers, then removed from circulation deliberately. Their current value, based on weight and market prices, exceeded $3 million for just the bar she had brought. The full vault, he estimated, could be worth anywhere from $60 million to over $100 million, depending on exact quantities and current market conditions. The numbers stopped feeling real at a certain point. She had crossed some threshold where wealth became abstract, a concept rather than a concrete thing. 3 million, 60 million, 100 million. The differences were vast, but they all represented the same fundamental shift. She would never struggle again. Maya would never go hungry, never lack for anything essential, never face the kind of grinding poverty that had defined their recent past. The relief of that certainty was almost overwhelming. But with the confirmation came new pressures. The assayer explained that moving forward would require legal representation, proper documentation of the find, and coordination with authorities to ensure everything was handled transparently. Trying to sell the gold privately, without proper channels, would expose her to risks far greater than anything she had faced so far. Criminal charges, seizure of assets, challenges to her ownership. The fortune she had found could become a burden that destroyed her if she mishandled the next steps. She hired a lawyer, a woman recommended by the assayer, who specialized in property law and asset recovery. Their first meeting took place in a conference room that smelled of coffee and old paper, where she laid out the full story. The purchase of the casino, the discovery of the vault, the authentication of the gold, the steps she had already taken to secure portions of it. The lawyer listened without interrupting, taking notes, her expression neutral until the very end when something close to a smile appeared. This is going to be complicated, but you have a strong case for ownership. The property was purchased legally. The vault was undisclosed at the time of sale. No one has claimed the gold in nearly 2 decades. As long as you've done nothing illegal in securing it, we should be able to establish clear title. The relief she felt hearing those words was tempered by the lawyer's next statement. The process would take time, weeks at minimum, possibly months. During that period, she would need to maintain documentation of every bar, cooperate fully with any investigations, and resist the temptation to sell or move more gold without proper authorization. The lawyer would handle communications with authorities, file the necessary paperwork, and represent her interests if challenges arose. In return, she would receive a percentage of the gold's value once ownership was confirmed and sales began. The formal notification to authorities happened 1 week later. The lawyer filed documents with the county, the state, and federal agencies that might have jurisdiction. The response was swift and multifaceted. Investigators arrived to inspect the property, document the vault, and verify the gold's existence. She cooperated fully, providing access, answering questions, presenting all the authentication reports she had gathered. The investigators were professional but thorough, their presence transforming the casino into something that felt more like a crime scene than her home. Maya was kept away during this period, staying with a neighbor who had always shown kindness even when others had not. The girl asked questions about what was happening, why strangers were at the building, why her mother looked so tired. She answered as honestly as she could without overwhelming her daughter with details that might frighten her. "We found something valuable. We're making sure everything is handled correctly. Soon things will be easier." Maya accepted this, though the worry in her eyes suggested she understood more than she was saying. The media attention began almost immediately after the formal notification. Local news picked up the story first, framing it as a human interest piece about a struggling single mother who had struck it rich. The coverage was generally positive, though it carried undertones of sensationalism that made her uncomfortable. Headlines emphasized the dramatic elements. Flooded casino yields hidden fortune. Single mother's desperate gamble pays off. Woman who spent last $500 becomes millionaire overnight. The stories were not wrong, but they flattened her experience into a narrative that felt incomplete. Reporters requested interviews, photographers wanted pictures, and television crews showed up at the casino without invitation. She declined most requests, following her lawyer's advice to limit public statements until ownership was finalized. The few interviews she did grant were carefully controlled, focused on facts rather than emotions, avoiding speculation about the gold's origins or her plans for the future. Still, the attention was exhausting, transforming her life into a spectacle she had never wanted. The reactions from those who had mocked her were perhaps the most revealing. Some offered apologies, awkward and unconvincing, their words carrying the weight of people who had been proven wrong and knew it. Others remained silent, their absence speaking louder than any words could. A few tried to reframe their earlier criticism as concern rather than judgment, claiming they had only wanted to protect her from making a terrible mistake. She accepted none of the apologies, nor did she reject them outright. She simply acknowledged them and moved on, refusing to give weight to opinions that had shifted so dramatically based on circumstances beyond her control. Her former co-workers at the diner reacted with a mixture of genuine happiness and thinly veiled envy. The manager who had asked if she needed time off now wondered if she would be quitting soon. The waitress who had joked about her hating stability now wanted to know if she remembered who her real friends were. The dishonest was uncomfortable. The relationships that had been merely professional now complicated by the sudden awareness of vast wealth disparity. She gave notice 2 weeks later, not out of spite, but out of recognition that continuing to work there would be impossible. The neighbor who had watched Maya throughout everything, who had never asked for payment and had never judged, received the first direct benefit of the discovery. She arrived one afternoon to find an envelope containing $10,000 in cash and a note explaining that it was partial repayment for kindness that could never truly be repaid. The woman cried when she opened it, then called to say it was too much, that she had never expected anything. They spoke for a long time, the conversation meandering through gratitude and friendship and the strange ways life could change. When they hung up, both understood that their relationship had shifted, but neither could say exactly how. The process of establishing legal ownership took 3 months. During that time, investigators verified the gold's provenance, confirmed that no outstanding claims existed, and documented the chain of custody from discovery to present. The lawyer filed motions, responded to challenges from parties who tried to assert various forms of interest in the property, and negotiated with tax authorities about how the fine would be classified and assessed. Each step required patience, documentation, and cooperation that tested her resolve. There were moments when the strain felt unbearable. Nights when she lay awake wondering if some technicality would strip everything away, leaving her worse off than before. Days when the scrutiny became too intense, when reporters camped outside the building, when strangers approached her in public with requests or demands that assumed intimacy based on shared knowledge of her story. The weight of sudden potential wealth was different from the weight of poverty, but it was no less heavy. Maya adapted with the same resilience she had shown through everything else, though signs of strain appeared in subtle ways. She became more withdrawn at school, less willing to engage with classmates whose behavior toward her had shifted so dramatically. She drew pictures that featured themes of isolation and transformation, small figures standing alone in empty landscapes, waiting for something to change. The school counselor called once to check in, expressing concern without alarm, suggesting that major life changes affected children in ways that were not always immediately visible. She listened, thanked her for the attention, and made a mental note to watch her daughter more carefully. The final determination came on a Thursday morning, delivered via email from her lawyer. The state had concluded its investigation and found no basis to challenge her ownership. The gold was legally hers. Sales could begin immediately, subject to normal tax obligations and reporting requirements. She read the message 3 times, each pass confirming that the words meant what she thought they meant. It was over. The uncertainty, the waiting, the fear that some authority would intervene. All of it ended with a simple notification that carried the weight of absolute transformation. She sat in the casino's 3rd-floor room, the space that had been their home through the most difficult months of her life, and allowed herself to feel what she had been holding back. Not joy, not yet. Relief first, washing through her in waves that left her shaking. Then exhaustion, the accumulated weight of months spent in constant tension finally released. And beneath both, a quiet satisfaction that she had been right. The gamble had paid off. The mockery had been wrong. She had survived. The sale of the first portion of gold happened through the lawyer's contacts, private buyers who paid market rates without demanding publicity. The money was transferred into accounts established for this purpose, subject to appropriate tax withholding, documented meticulously. The amount was staggering even after fees and taxes. Enough to purchase a home outright, secure Maya's education through college, invest for long-term stability. And that was from selling less than a quarter of what the vault contained. She did not move immediately. The decision to stay in the casino for a few more weeks was partly practical, allowing time to find the right property, to transition carefully rather than rushing into decisions driven by sudden wealth. But it was also symbolic. She wanted to leave on her own terms, when she was ready, not because circumstances forced her out. The building that everyone had dismissed as worthless had given her everything. She owed it at least the respect of a deliberate departure. Word of the confirmed ownership spread quickly, reaching everyone who had doubted her. The reactions varied, but a pattern emerged. Those who had been most vocal in their criticism now fell into silence. Those who had offered tentative support felt vindicated. Those who had withheld judgment seemed unsurprised. She heard through third parties about conversations happening without her, speculations about how much she was worth now, debates about whether she deserved it, arguments about whether the gold should have been public property. She ignored all of it, focusing instead on the practical work of building a new life. The vindication, when it came fully, was not the dramatic moment she might have once imagined. There was no confrontation with those who had mocked her, no opportunity to throw their words back in their faces, No scene where they admitted error and begged forgiveness. Instead, it arrived quietly in the slow accumulation of changed behaviors and revised assessments. People who had pitted her now asked for advice. Family members who had criticized her now wanted to reconnect. Strangers who had dismissed her now treated her with deference that felt unearned and uncomfortable. Her mother called again, this time without pretense or agenda. The conversation was awkward, both of them aware of how wrong the earlier judgments had been, neither quite knowing how to address it directly. They talked around the subject for a while before her mother finally said what needed to be said. I was wrong. I should have supported you. She accepted the apology without gloating, without making her mother suffer more than the admission itself required. They spoke for an hour, rebuilding something that had been damaged, knowing it would never be quite what it was, but hoping it could become something better. The real vindication came not from others' changed opinions, but from what she could now provide for Maya. The security of knowing they would never be hungry again, never face eviction, never measure their lives in pennies stretched too thin. The freedom to make choices based on what was right rather than what was affordable. The ability to plan for a future that extended beyond the next crisis. These were victories that mattered more than any public acknowledgement of how wrong the doubters had been. She purchased a house in a quiet neighborhood, modest by the standards of her new wealth, but palatial compared to anything they had known. 3 bedrooms, a yard with trees, windows that let in sunlight without revealing decay. Maya's reaction when she first saw it was worth everything. The girl ran from room to room, her excitement finally breaking through the careful restraint she had maintained for so long. She chose her own bedroom, claimed a corner for her books, and asked if they could get a dog. Yes, she said. Yes to all of it. The casino remained in her possession, though she had no plans to restore it. The building had served its purpose. It had sheltered them when no one else would, had hidden treasure that transformed their lives, had proven that sometimes the things others dismiss hold value invisible until someone cares enough to look. She considered donating it to the city for demolition or preservation as a historical site, but had not yet decided. For now, it stood empty again, its secret revealed, its purpose fulfilled. On their last night, before moving into the new house, she and Maya returned to the casino one final time. They climbed to the 3rd floor, to the room that had been their home, and sat together in the sleeping bags that would soon be donated. The building was quiet around them, its creaks and groans familiar now, almost comforting. Maya leaned against her, small and warm and safe, and asked the question that had been building for weeks. Are we going to be okay now? This time, the answer came without hesitation, without qualification, without the desperate hope that had colored her previous responses. Yes, we're going to be okay. They sat in silence for a while longer, mother and daughter in an abandoned casino that had saved them both, watching as darkness fell and the future opened wide before them. The first morning in their new house arrived with a gentleness she had almost forgotten was possible. Sunlight filtered through clean windows, falling across floors that did not creak or sag. The air smelled fresh rather than moldy, carrying no trace of decay or dampness. She woke slowly, disoriented at first by the absence of the sounds that had marked their time in the casino. No dripping water, no groaning metal, no distant splash of something moving through flooded spaces below. Just silence, peaceful and complete. Maya was already awake, standing at her bedroom window and looking out at the backyard with an expression of wonder that had become more frequent in recent days. The girl had begun to shed the protective shell she had built around herself, the armor of careful words and measured expectations that poverty had demanded. She laughed more easily now, asked for things without apologizing, made plans that extended beyond the immediate present. The transformation was gradual but undeniable, each small change revealing layers of childhood that had been suppressed by necessity. They spent that first day exploring their new space with the excitement of travelers discovering unfamiliar territory. Every room held possibilities. The kitchen where they could cook real meals on a functioning stove. The bathroom with hot water that flowed when you turn the tap. the living room large enough for furniture they would choose together rather than accept from others. The simplest luxuries felt extraordinary after months of making do with so little. Running water, electricity, heat, the building blocks of normal life restored to them after an absence that had made their value painfully clear. The neighborhood welcomed them quietly, in a way established communities greet newcomers who seem unlikely to disturb the prevailing calm. Neighbors introduced themselves with polite distance, their questions carefully neutral, avoiding direct reference to how she had come to afford a house here. She appreciated the restraint, the recognition that her story was hers to share or withhold. In time, some would become friends. Others would remain cordial strangers. Both outcomes were acceptable, a vast improvement over the scrutiny and judgment that had defined recent months. Maya's transition to a new school went more smoothly than expected. The administration had been briefed about their circumstances, enough to understand that sensitivity was warranted without knowing details that might invite gossip. Her daughter's teacher was experienced and kind, establishing routines that helped Maya feel grounded while giving her space to adjust. Within weeks, she was bringing home invitations to birthday parties, talking about friends she had made, carrying herself with a confidence that had been dormant so long it felt newly born. The financial transformation required adjustment of its own. She had gone from counting pennies to managing wealth she still struggled to comprehend fully. The lawyer had connected her with financial advisors who specialized in sudden windfalls, people who had worked with lottery winners and inheritance recipients, individuals whose lives had changed overnight in ways that demanded expertise most people never needed. They helped her establish trusts, invest conservatively, plan for long-term security rather than short-term indulgence. The numbers were staggering even after taxes, fees, and careful allocation. The initial sale of gold had generated enough to purchase the house outright, establish college funds for Maya, and create an investment portfolio designed to generate income indefinitely. The remaining gold, still secured in various locations, represented additional millions she did not need immediately but could access if circumstances changed. She had crossed from poverty into wealth so vast it felt almost fictional, yet the bank statements confirmed its reality with every deposit and balance update. She did not announce her wealth publicly or live in ways that advertised it. The house was comfortable but not ostentatious. The car she purchased was reliable but not luxury. Her clothing remained practical rather than designer. These choices were partly practical, motivated by security concerns that came with being known to possess significant assets. But they also reflected something deeper, a recognition that material display had never been what she wanted. What she had sought, what she had finally found, was security. Freedom from the constant anxiety of scarcity, from the grinding pressure of bills she could not pay, from the fear that one misstep would collapse everything. The work of selling the remaining gold continued over many months, handled through the lawyer and specialized dealers who operated discreetly. Each transaction was documented meticulously, taxes paid promptly, everything kept transparent to avoid complications that could arise from attempting to hide assets. The process was tedious but necessary, transforming metal bars into legal currency that could be used without restriction. By the time the vault was finally empty, the total value exceeded $87 million, a figure so large it ceased to feel connected to her daily reality. The question of what to do with such wealth became increasingly pressing as the months passed. She had secured her immediate needs and Maya's future. The rest sat in accounts and investments, growing steadily, but serving no purpose beyond accumulation. The advisors suggested various options: philanthropic foundations, real estate investments, business ventures, all carefully calibrated to preserve and grow wealth across generations. She listened to their presentations, appreciating their expertise, while feeling disconnected from plans that extended decades into a future she still struggled to imagine clearly. Eventually, clarity came not from financial planning sessions, but from an unexpected source. She received a letter from a woman she had never met, someone who had read about her story in the news and felt compelled to reach out. The letter was handwritten, several pages long, describing circumstances eerily similar to what she had experienced. A single mother facing eviction, overwhelmed by medical bills, watching her children suffer the consequences of poverty she could not escape despite working multiple jobs. The woman was not asking for money directly, but her desperation was evident in every carefully chosen word. She wanted to know how it had been survived, how hope had been maintained, whether there was any advice that might help. She read the letter multiple times, each pass bringing memories of her own desperation flooding back. The mathematics of poverty that made escape nearly impossible. The judgment from people who had never experienced it. The exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue into something that eroded the soul. She remembered all of it with a clarity that wealth had not diminished, and she understood with absolute certainty what she needed to do with the fortune she had been given. The foundation was established 3 months later, structured to provide direct financial assistance to families facing circumstances similar to what she had endured. Single parents dealing with medical debt, families on the edge of homelessness, children whose potential was being crushed by poverty they had done nothing to cause. The focus was narrow and intentional, avoiding the diffusion of resources across too many causes in favor of deep impact for specific people whose lives could be transformed by relatively modest intervention. The first grants went out quietly, processed through applications that prioritized need over narrative appeal. A single father received enough to cover surgery his daughter desperately needed. A mother facing eviction got 6 months of rent, buying time to stabilize her employment situation. A family drowning in utility shutoff notices received payment for past due bills and counseling on budget management. Each grant was accompanied by follow-up support, connections to resources, and ongoing contact that recognized money alone was rarely enough. The response was overwhelming. Applications flooded in faster than the foundation could process them, each one a story of struggle that could have been her own. She read them personally at first, unable to delegate the task of sorting through such raw desperation to strangers. The work was emotionally exhausting, forcing her to confront repeatedly how common her experience had been, how many people were living the same nightmare she had escaped through a chance so unlikely it felt almost cruel in its randomness. Maya noticed the change in her mother, the way she spent evenings reading applications, the tears that sometimes came unbidden when a particular story struck too close. The girl asked questions, wanted to understand what her mother was doing, why it seemed to make her both sad and determined. She explained it as simply as she could, describing the foundation, the grants, the attempt to help others the way she wished someone had helped them before the casino. Maya listened carefully, then asked if she could help too, if there was something a child could do to make a difference. Together, they developed a program that sent books to children and families receiving grants, small libraries curated based on age and interest, accompanied by notes that Maya wrote herself. The messages were simple, encouragement from someone who understood what it felt like to go without, who knew that hope could survive even in difficult circumstances. The responses that came back, thank you letters from children who had received books, became Maya's most treasured possessions, proof that even small acts of kindness could matter. The community's perception of her continued to evolve, shaped now less by the gold discovery itself than by what she chose to do with its proceeds. The foundation's work became known gradually, its impact visible in changed lives that people could point to directly. Families that had been on the edge of collapse stabilized and thrived. Children who might have fallen through cracks found support that let them continue their education. The effects rippled outward, touching people who had never heard her name but benefited from resources she had provided. Not everyone responded positively. Some accused her of trying to buy redemption, of using charity to paper over the luck she had not earned. Others questioned why she did not do more, why she kept millions for herself when so much need existed. The criticism stung, particularly because it came from people who had no idea what poverty actually felt like, who had never faced the choices it demanded. She learned to ignore such voices, focusing instead on the families whose lives were concretely improved, the children who wrote thank you letters, the single parents who could finally breathe. Her mother's redemption came gradually, built through small interactions that accumulated into something resembling understanding. She began visiting regularly, spending time with Maya, helping with the foundation's work when asked. The relationship would never be what it might have been if support had come when it was needed most, but it became something workable, a connection based more on present actions than past failures. They did not discuss the months of criticism and distance directly. Instead, they moved forward, both recognizing that some wounds healed better through time than through forced confrontation. The neighbor who had watched Maya through everything, who had shown kindness when it was neither expected nor repaid, became a permanent part of their lives. She helped with the foundation, screening applications, coordinating support services, bringing the practical wisdom of someone who had raised children through hard times herself. The friendship deepened, built on mutual respect and shared purpose, becoming one of the relationships she valued most. When the neighbor's furnace broke one winter, she had it replaced without being asked. The gesture small given her resources, but meaningful in what it represented. The reunion with former co-workers from the diner happened by chance one afternoon when she stopped in for coffee, drawn by nostalgia more than need. The atmosphere was awkward at first, everyone aware that circumstances had changed dramatically, uncertain how to interact across such vast disparity. But as they talked, some of the old ease returned. They shared updates, laughed at memories, acknowledged how strange life could be. When she left, she gave the manager an envelope containing a substantial anonymous donation for distribution among the staff, people who worked too hard for too little, just as she once had. The person who had sold her the casino, the county official who had processed the auction, reached out months later with an apology. He had not known about the gold, he explained. The sale had been conducted in good faith, the property priced to move rather than to reflect hidden value. He wanted her to know that if there had been any way to predict what she would find, the terms would have been different. She listened without resentment, understanding that his regret came from believing he had given away something valuable rather than from concern for her well-being. She thanked him for the call and ended the conversation without offering reassurance he had done nothing wrong. The casino itself remained a point of contemplation. She visited it occasionally, driving out to the flooded building and sitting in her car, looking at the structure that had sheltered them through their darkest period. It was unchanged by the events it had hosted, still half-submerged, still decaying, still dismissed by anyone who passed as a worthless relic. She considered many options for what to do with it. Demolition seemed wasteful. Restoration seemed impossible. Donation raised questions about liability and purpose. Eventually, she decided to preserve it as it was, hiring security to prevent vandalism and ensuring the property remained accessible only to those with permission. The building would stand as a private memorial, a reminder of where she had been and what had been possible when desperation met opportunity. Some might call it sentimental. She considered it necessary, a way of honoring the fact that worth and value were not always obvious, that things dismissed by others could hold significance invisible until circumstance revealed it. The first anniversary of the discovery passed quietly. She marked it not with celebration, but with reflection, sitting alone in the room that had been their home within the casino, now empty and silent. A year earlier, she had stood in almost this exact spot, newly evicted, mocked by nearly everyone, facing a future that seemed to offer nothing but continued decline. The transformation since then was so complete it felt almost unreal, as though she had lived two entirely separate lives connected only by continuity of memory. She thought about the choices she had made, the desperation that had driven her to bid on a worthless building, the moment she had found the hidden vault, the decision to proceed with authentication rather than hiding what she had discovered. Each choice had carried risks that could have ended differently. The gold might have been fake. The legal proceedings might have stripped her of ownership. The publicity might have invited dangers she could not have anticipated or controlled. That none of those outcomes had materialized felt less like good fortune than like the universe, occasionally balancing scales that had been weighted against her for so long. Maya's transformation was perhaps the most profound change of all. The girl who had learned to expect nothing, to guard her hopes, to make herself small so as not to burden anyone, had become someone who laughed freely, who planned for futures extending years ahead, who believed that good things could happen without catastrophe following immediately behind. The shift had been gradual enough that only in retrospect did its magnitude become clear. She was watching her daughter experience the childhood that poverty had stolen, reclaiming years that could never be fully recovered but could at least be followed by better ones. The question of fairness arose, sometimes in quiet moments. She had done nothing to earn the gold beyond purchasing property others had rejected. The transformation of her life was not the result of exceptional talent or moral virtue. It was the product of chance, pure and simple. Luck that the building had contained a vault. Luck that no one else had discovered it first. Luck that legal structures allowed her to claim what she had found. The arbitrariness of it troubled her, highlighting how easily circumstances could shift based on factors entirely beyond individual control. But reflection also revealed a deeper truth. While the gold had been luck, what she did with it had been choice. She could have hoarded everything, lived ostentatiously, ignored others still trapped in the poverty she had escaped. Instead, she had chosen to build something that extended beyond herself, that recognized her fortune as an obligation as much as a gift. That choice, repeated daily through the Foundation's work, felt like the only ethical response to unearned advantage. It did not make the system fair, but it at least attempted to mitigate its cruelest outcomes. The broader impact of her story extended beyond the Foundation's direct work. She received letters from people she had never met, strangers who had read about her experience and felt inspired to take their own risks, to pursue opportunities others dismissed, to resist the crushing weight of others' low expectations. Some of the letters came from single parents who had bought cheap properties hoping to find their own hidden treasure, though she suspected most would find only the hard work of renovation rather than fortune. Others came from people who simply wanted to say that her story had given them hope during difficult times, proof that circumstances could change even when change seemed impossible. The media attention that had been intense immediately after the discovery gradually faded, replaced by newer stories and fresher drama. She was grateful for the retreat into relative anonymity, though she understood that her story had entered a kind of collective memory, becoming the example people cited when discussing sudden wealth or dismissed opportunities. The narrative had been simplified in the retelling, stripped of nuance and uncertainty, transformed into a parable about risk and reward that did not quite capture the desperation and fear that had motivated her actual choices. She did several interviews in the second year, carefully selected, focused on sharing lessons rather than sensationalizing her experience. The message she tried to convey was consistent across all of them. That poverty was not a personal failing, but a structural condition that limited choices and amplified consequences. That judgment from those who had never experienced it was both common and cruel. That opportunities existed in places others overlooked, though finding them required desperation most people fortunately never faced. The interviews received mixed responses, some praising her candor, others accusing her of lecturing from a position of privilege she had not earned. The college fund established for Maya grew steadily, invested conservatively to ensure it would be available regardless of what happened to the rest. She wanted her daughter to have choices, to pursue education or training or whatever path made sense without financial constraint dictating outcomes. But she also wanted Maya to remember what scarcity felt like, to carry forward empathy born from experience rather than abstract sympathy. The balance was delicate, trying to provide security without insulating her daughter from the reality most people faced. As Maya grew older, their conversations about money became more sophisticated. The girl asked hard questions. Why did some people have so much while others had so little? Why had they been lucky when the woman who wrote that first letter had not? or responsibility came with wealth they had not worked for. She answered honestly, acknowledging uncertainty where it existed, avoiding platitudes that would insult her daughter's intelligence. Together, they navigated ethical terrain that had no clear map, trying to find approaches that honored both gratitude for what they had and recognition of what others lacked. The foundation expanded slowly, adding staff and infrastructure while maintaining the personal touch that had defined its earliest grants. She remained involved in decision-making, but stepped back from reading every application, recognizing that the emotional toll was unsustainable and that others could do the work as well or better. The transition was difficult, requiring trust that did not come naturally to someone whose survival had depended on maintaining control. But it was necessary, allowing the foundation to help more families while preserving her own capacity to be present for Maya. The second major gift came on Maya's 10th birthday. She had been thinking about it for months, wrestling with the question of what would be meaningful without being overwhelming. In the end, she chose education, donating enough to the local school district to fully fund arts and music programs that had been cut years earlier due to budget constraints. The gift was made anonymously, routed through the foundation in ways that obscured its source, because she wanted the focus to be on the programs themselves rather than on her generosity. Maya learned about the gift weeks later when her school announced the restoration of art classes. She had figured out the connection immediately, recognizing the timing and knowing her mother's priorities. Rather than being angry about the secrecy, she seemed proud, understanding without being told why anonymity mattered. They talked about it that evening, discussing the difference between helping publicly and helping quietly, why both had value but served different purposes. Maya listened carefully, then said something that stayed with her for years afterward. "You're making the money mean something." The simplicity of the observation, the clarity with which it captured what she was trying to do, struck her deeply. Yes, that was exactly it. The gold could have remained hidden forever, serving no purpose, enriching no one. Or it could have been squandered on luxuries that brought temporary pleasure but lasting emptiness. Instead, it was being transformed into something that mattered, into changed lives and expanded opportunities and hope restored to people who had lost it. The money itself was neutral. What it meant depended entirely on how it was used. The third year brought challenges she had not anticipated. Distant relatives emerged, people she barely remembered or had never met, suddenly interested in reconnecting. Some were genuine, seeking relationship without ulterior motive. Others were transparently mercenary, their requests for loans or investments arriving within minutes of reintroduction. She learned to distinguish between the two, protecting herself while remaining open to connections that felt authentic. The process was exhausting and disillusioning, revealing how many people viewed her primarily through the lens of her wealth. The foundation faced its own challenges. As its reputation grew, so did attempts to exploit it. Fraudulent applications appeared, carefully crafted stories designed to manipulate sympathy rather than represent genuine need. Staff members had to develop verification processes that balanced efficiency with thoroughness, ensuring resources went to people who truly needed them without creating bureaucratic barriers that excluded legitimate applicants. The work was harder than it had been at the beginning, when every application had been heartbreaking and obviously real. She hired investigators after one particularly egregious case of fraud, a family that had received a substantial grant and used it for luxury purchases rather than the medical bills they had claimed were crushing them. The investigation revealed a pattern of similar applications to other charities, a coordinated scheme to exploit sympathy for personal gain. The discovery was devastating, not because of the money itself, but because it represented betrayal of trust extended in good faith. Resources that could have helped someone genuine had been stolen by people who viewed desperation as an opportunity for profit. The incident forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the complexities of charity. Not everyone in need was virtuous. Not every compelling story was real. The work of helping others required discernment as much as generosity, protecting resources so they could reach people who genuinely needed them rather than being siphoned off by those skilled at manipulation. She increased security measures, added verification steps, and accepted that some degree of fraud was inevitable in any system designed to help it scale. Despite these challenges, the Foundation's impact continued to grow. By the fourth year, it had assisted over 300 families directly, with cascading effects that touched thousands more. Children stayed in school who might have dropped out. Parents found stability that let them pursue better employment. Medical care was received that prevented conditions from becoming catastrophic. The stories accumulated, each one a concrete example of what became possible when financial barriers were removed, even temporarily. She began speaking publicly about the work, accepting invitations to conferences and panels where she could share what the Foundation had learned. Her message focused less on her own story, which had been told countless times, and more on systemic issues the Foundation's work had revealed. The way medical debt trapped families in poverty cycles they could not escape. The shortage of affordable housing that made homelessness an ever-present threat for working people. The gaps in social support systems that left vulnerable populations without recourse when crisis struck. The speaking engagements brought her into contact with others doing similar work, people who had built organizations addressing poverty from various angles. She learned from them, incorporated their insights, built relationships that strengthened everyone's efforts. A network emerged, informal but effective, of people and organizations working toward common goals. The collaboration multiplied impact, allowing resources to be directed more efficiently and gaps in support to be identified and addressed. Maya accompanied her to one such event, curious to see what her mother's work looked like beyond the home office and late-night application reviews. She sat in the audience during the presentation, watching her mother speak to a room full of strangers about poverty, opportunity, and responsibility. Afterward, she asked questions that revealed how much she had understood, how deeply she was processing ideas that would shape her own worldview. The Foundation, she realized, was not just her work. It was becoming their shared mission, something they would carry forward together. The 5th anniversary of the discovery brought different emotions than the first. Less reflection on personal transformation, more assessment of what had been built and what remained to be done. The Foundation was established, operating smoothly, helping hundreds of families each year. Her own life was stable, Maya thriving, resources secured for whatever future brought. But the work felt incomplete. For every family they helped, dozens more remained trapped in circumstances they could not escape alone. The scale of need dwarfed their capacity to address it. She increased her annual giving, directing more of the remaining wealth toward the Foundation's operations. Financial advisors cautioned against depleting principal too quickly, warning that preservation of capital was essential for long-term sustainability. She understood their concerns, but questioned the logic of sitting on resources while people suffered from lack of them. What was the point of wealth that outlasted its owner if it could be used immediately to prevent harm? The tension between prudent management and urgent need remained unresolved, a question she revisited constantly without reaching comfortable conclusion. The media rediscovered her story periodically, usually around anniversaries or slow news cycles. She granted occasional interviews, but became more selective about which stories she participated in. Too many reporters wanted to focus on the gold discovery itself, treating it as inspirational tale about lucky breaks rather than examining the systems that made such luck necessary for survival. She pushed back against that framing, insisting that interviews include discussion of structural inequality, though she recognized her leverage was limited once reporters shaped the final story. One interview in particular reached wide audience and generated substantial discussion. The reporter asked directly about fairness, whether she felt guilty about wealth gained through luck rather than merit. She answered honestly, acknowledging the randomness while defending the choices she had made afterward. The response resonated, sparking conversations about wealth redistribution, social obligation, and the ethics of inheritance versus earned income. Some praised her candor. Others accused her of self-righteousness, claiming that giving away money was easy when you had millions. Both responses felt incomplete, missing the complexity she was trying to express. Maya entered middle school, the transition bringing new challenges. She was old enough now to understand fully what her mother's wealth meant, to recognize the privileges it afforded, to feel the weight of being different from most of her peers. She struggled with it sometimes, uncertain how to navigate friendships complicated by financial disparity, how to be generous without being condescending, how to acknowledge advantage without diminishing her own worth. They talked through these challenges together, mother and daughter, working to find balance between gratitude and humility. The foundation launched a mentorship program in its 6th year, connecting families who had received grants with volunteers who could provide ongoing support and guidance. The initiative recognized that money alone rarely solved complex problems, that sustainable change required relationships, knowledge transfer, and continued encouragement. The program grew quickly, volunteers drawn from various backgrounds united by desire to help in concrete ways. Maya participated, paired with a girl her own age whose family had received support, building a friendship that taught both of them valuable lessons about shared humanity across economic divides. The casino finally came down in the 7th year, not through demolition or natural collapse, but through careful deconstruction that salvaged materials for reuse while clearing the property. She attended the final day, watching as machinery pulled down walls that had sheltered them through their lowest point. The process was surprisingly emotional, each fallen section carrying memories of cold nights, uncertain futures, and desperate hopes that had somehow been realized. When the last wall fell, she stood among the rubble and felt both grief and release. The land where the casino had stood was donated to the city with specific stipulations. It would become a community center, offering resources for families in crisis, job training, legal aid, financial counseling, childcare support. Services designed to prevent the kind of desperation that had driven her to purchase a worthless building in the first place. The center would be named not for her, which she refused, but for Maya, a recognition that children bore the weight of poverty, they did nothing to cause, and deserve support systems that acknowledge their innocence. The groundbreaking ceremony drew substantial attention. Community leaders and media representatives and families who would benefit from the center services. She stood beside Maya during speeches, both of them uncomfortable with public recognition, but understanding its value for drawing attention to the cause. When asked to speak, she kept remarks brief, focusing on the need for such resources and the hope that this center would prevent others from reaching the breaking point she had faced. Maya's speech surprised everyone with its poise and clarity. She spoke about what it had felt like to be poor, to watch her mother struggle, to learn that the world judged people by circumstances beyond their control. She described the relief of escaping those circumstances and the responsibility she felt to help others escape as well. The audience listened in silence, moved by words delivered without self-pity or condescension, just honest reflection from someone who remembered what hardship felt like and refused to forget. When she finished, the applause was genuine and sustained, recognition of both her courage and her wisdom. The years that followed brought continuity rather than dramatic change. The foundation grew but remained true to its mission. Maya flourished, growing into a thoughtful young person whose values have been shaped by experience most children were fortunately spared. Their relationship deepened, built on shared purpose and mutual respect, the bond between them strengthened by everything they had survived together. The wealth that had transformed their circumstances receded into background, important for what it enabled, but no longer the defining fact of their existence. She reflected sometimes on the trajectory of her life, the improbable path from eviction notice to wealth beyond measure. The journey had been neither smooth nor simple. It had required desperation, chance, courage, and choices that could easily have ended differently. She did not romanticize poverty or claim it had made her better. It had merely been survived, its lessons learned at costs no one should have to pay. What she had done afterward, the foundation and the center and the countless families helped, that was the part that mattered. The question of what would have happened if she had never found the gold arose occasionally. Where would they be now? Still struggling, probably. Maybe homeless. Perhaps separated. Maya placed in foster care while she searched for stability she could not provide. The alternative timelines were dark and entirely plausible, differing from reality only by the thickness of a hidden vault door. That proximity to catastrophe never fully left her, remaining as a quiet awareness that shaped every decision. She taught Maya about this, about how fragile security could be, how quickly circumstances could change, how important it was to extend help to others because anyone could need it tomorrow. The lessons were not abstract. They were rooted in memory of specific moments when everything had hung in balance, when one different choice would have sent them spiraling into an abyss with no bottom. Maya absorbed these lessons, carrying them forward into her own worldview, understanding that privilege was temporary and obligation was permanent. The foundation celebrated its 10th anniversary with a gala that raised additional funds and drew attention to its ongoing work. Hundreds attended, including families who had been helped, volunteers who had contributed time, donors who had added their resources to hers. The evening was both celebration and reckoning, an acknowledgement of progress made and distance remaining. She gave a speech that focused less on past achievements than on future commitments, pledging to continue the work as long as resources and energy allowed. Maya, now a teenager, worked alongside her in planning the event. She had become deeply involved in the foundation's operations, spending weekends reviewing applications, corresponding with grant recipients, helping coordinate support services. Her commitment was genuine, born not from obligation, but from understanding what difference such help could make. She had begun talking about career plans that centered around social work or policy advocacy, paths that would allow her to continue this work in expanded form. The thought of Maya dedicating her life to helping others filled her with complex emotions. Pride, certainly, at seeing her daughter develop such strong values, but also concern, knowing how demanding such work could be, how emotionally draining, how little society valued those who chose service over profit. She wanted Maya to have choices, to pursue whatever brought fulfillment, whether that aligned with the foundation's mission or not. They talked about it sometimes, mother and daughter weighing options and possibilities, both aware that decisions made now would shape decades to come. The final sale of gold happened in the foundation's 11th year. The last bars converted to currency and directed toward endowment designed to sustain operations indefinitely. With it came a sense of completion, the transformation from metal discovered by chance to systematized help for families in need finally finished. The total impact was difficult to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggested the foundation had directly assisted over 2,000 families and indirectly benefited tens of thousands more. Children had stayed in school. Medical crises had been averted. Evictions had been prevented. Each intervention, a pebble, creating ripples that extended far beyond the initial splash. She was 50 years old when she finally felt that the work had reached sustainable equilibrium. The foundation operated independently, staffed by professionals whose expertise exceeded her own. The community center thrived, serving hundreds of families monthly. Maya was preparing for college, her future bright and unbounded by the constraints that had nearly crushed them both. The trajectory from that first morning holding an eviction notice to this moment of stability felt simultaneously impossibly long and remarkably compressed. On the anniversary of the day she had bid on the casino, she drove out to where the building had stood. The community center occupied the space now, its architecture modern and welcoming, nothing remaining of the flooded structure that had changed everything. She walked through the center's halls, observing families receiving help, children playing in safe spaces, people finding resources they desperately needed. This was what the gold had become. Not personal luxury or dynastic wealth, but human dignity restored and futures reclaimed. Maya joined her for this visit, both of them walking quietly through spaces that held meaning only they fully understood. The girl had been 7 when they moved into the casino, sleeping in a cold room on the 3rd floor. eating meals prepared on a camp stove, measuring life in units of survival. She was 18 now, confident and capable, preparing to leave for university, where she would study social policy and continue the work they had started together. The transformation was complete in her as well. The girl who had learned not to hope replaced by a young woman who believed change was possible because she had lived it. They stood together in the center's main gathering space, surrounded by the sounds of normal life. Conversations and laughter, children playing, staff members helping families navigate complex systems. This was the opposite of that desperate morning years ago. This was abundance where there had been scarcity, community where there had been isolation, hope where there had been despair. None of it would have existed if she had not bought that building, if she had not found that vault, if she had not chosen to transform luck into purpose. As they prepared to leave, Maya turned to her and asked a question that had perhaps been forming for years. Do you think it was worth it? Everything we went through to get here? She considered the question carefully, understanding its full weight. The months of poverty and fear, the mockery and judgment, the risks taken and barely survived. Against all of it, the lives helped, the foundation built, the center serving families every day. Worth was subjective, unmeasurable in any objective sense. But standing in that space, watching people receive help they desperately needed because gold had been found and properly used, she knew her answer. Yes, it was worth it. They walked to the car together, mother and daughter, their shadows stretching long in the afternoon sun. Behind them, the community center hummed with activity, evidence that sometimes the things others dismiss hold value beyond imagining, that desperation can lead to discovery, and that fortune found by chance becomes meaningful only through how it is shared. The story that had begun with an eviction notice and a wreck bid had become something larger than either of them, a testament to resilience, transformation, and the obligation that comes with unearned advantage. As they drove away, she thought about the woman whose letter had started her on this path, the stranger who had reached out from her own desperation, seeking hope. She wondered if that woman had found stability, if her circumstances had improved, if she knew that her letter had sparked something that would help thousands. She made a mental note to have someone at the foundation try to locate her, to offer help if it was still needed, to close the circle that had been opened years ago. The future stretched ahead, uncertain in its details but clear in its direction. The foundation would continue. Maya would build her own path while staying connected to this work. The community center would serve families for decades. The gold that had been hidden in darkness for so long would continue radiating outward through changed lives and expanded opportunities. And she would remain grateful, not for the luck that had found her, but for the chance to transform it into something that mattered. The sun was setting as they reached home, painting the sky in colors that reminded her of beginnings rather than endings. She parked the car and sat for a moment, Maya beside her, both of them quiet with their own thoughts. The house waited, warm and stable, bought with gold found in a flooded casino by a woman desperate enough to take a chance everyone else thought was foolish. Inside, dinner would need to be made, homework would need to be completed, ordinary life would continue in all its mundane necessity. But first, this moment of reflection, this acknowledgement of how far they had come and how many had been helped along the way. She reached over and took Maya's hand, squeezing it gently, the gesture carrying everything words could not quite express. Her daughter squeezed back, understanding without explanation, sharing the weight and the gratitude and the recognition that they had been given something rare and had done their best to honor it. They got out of the car and walked toward the house together, mother and daughter, their path illuminated by light spilling from windows that would never go dark for lack of payment. Behind them, the story continued, written not in gold bars or dollar amounts, but in lives changed and futures brightened and hope restored to people who had learned, as she once had, that circumstances could shift in ways both terrible and wonderful, and that what mattered most was how you responded when fortune finally smiled. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.